latest quarter GDP data of 6.1% growth versus consensus estimate of 5.0%. Is this beat the biggest surprise in the GDP data, or something else?
Yes, the GDP beat was a pleasant surprise. Was it the only surprise from the GDP data, or was there a bigger surprise hidden elsewhere? So, if you break down the GDP numbers, primarily you have three components, three or four components on the expenditure side. You have private consumption, you have government expenditure, government investments, and then the private investments. Finally, the private investments. The government investments and private investments are generally it's clubbed as capex cycle. The biggest surprise in GDP data was in the final component, which was private investments. To everyone's surprise, India's investment narrative closed with a big bang last year, with Q4 numbers for private investments surprising on the upside. Let me explain. If you go back and look at the last 10 years data for private investments, it's been languishing at around 3 to 4% of GDP. As far as the private investments are concerned, it is almost last decade was the last decade. In comparison, in those glory days of 2010s, the private investment as a percent of GDP it even briefly touched 17% of GDP. It's another matter that India Inc. overinvested in that period, which led consequently to a huge drag on capex cycle in the subsequent 10 years. While one may argue that 17% of GDP was an overinvestment, certainly 3 to 4% of GDP is on the other extreme. So if India were to grow at 8 to 9% growth, GDP growth, very convincing turn on capex cycle to the tune of at least 8 to 9% of GDP is crucial. At last, one is certainly seeing signs of this time correction, this adjustment on the capex cycle for the last 10 years coming to an end, nearing its end. And one is likely to see a huge upswing in capex cycle in the coming decade. Before we move on further, we must also acknowledge the elusive nature of capex cycle in terms of predictions, because there's been many false alarms, false starts for capex and investment cycle for India, leading to disappointments for many investors, many economists, and eminent institutions like even RBI. For example, RBI every time in its commentary, monetary policy commentary and policy announcements, whenever the utilization used to go beyond 74-75%, they used to call that, onsetting of capex cycle, only to get disappointed later with utilization falling way below 70%. This has happened many times in the last few years. So there's been a lot of false starts and false alarms when it comes to capex turn. Is this time different? That's what we are going to explore in this video. This time, potentially it could be different because of the upsurge in investments in the Q4 GDP numbers. So let's look at the Q4 GDP numbers much more in detail with respect to private investments and the capex cycle. The numbers were stunning in Q4 for capital investments and projects. For the first time, the private investments touched close to about 10.5 trillion in the last quarter, which was Q4 of last year. Including the government and other investments, the overall investments outlay touched close to about 14.5 trillion rupees. This is all-time high for any quarter. That's very critical to understand. And if you look at private investments for the whole year, it was almost 25 trillion rupees, which is close to about 9%. In fact, it was well over 9% of GDP for last year. What is much more interesting to notice is the one which propelled the entire investment projects last year was manufacturing. It pushed the overall investments close to about 37 trillion, which includes private investments, government and state government investments altogether, in which the private investments alone was over 25 trillion rupees. And if you look at vis-a-vis last year, these 37 trillion total capex, investments was over 92% higher compared to last year. This is again one of the highest in recent times. So one more thing which is noteworthy is how the share of manufacturing in the overall investment projects. In the first 3 quarters, it used to be around 45%. It has moved to over 65% in the last quarter. And if you look at the private investment as a share, it used to be around 61% or 65% in the first 3 quarters, which has moved all the way to about 72% in the last quarter. So this is the data from Micro. Now, of course, it's showing the kind of signs that capex turn could at last be, there for India. But what does the micro data tell you? On the ground, from the management commentaries, earning calls, the infrastructure companies, what do they tell you? So we looked at one of the commentary from, a leading infra player. And from his commentary, the data which is, in terms of what kind of investment projects which are now getting laid out in terms of thermal refineries and steel and wind and solar power, the numbers are really staggering as per this commentary. For example, steel, we are talking about 13 million tons expansion in the next year. Refineries, we are talking about 80 million tons projects. And wind is talking about 5 gigawatts. And thermal, we are talking about 25 gigawatts expansion. And cement is talking about 80 million tons. So the management commentary from this particular infra player is pointing to a huge upswing in capex cycle. That's from the micro data. This is commentary from the infra player. What we are referring is also in our portfolio stock, which going by this commentary, though we have got into this stock 1/5 of the price of the current price, going by this commentary of this particular company, there's more to come in terms of what could happen to their earning potential. So overall, this is a commentary from micro, from the earnings from the infra player. So if you put together, in summary, if you look at the micro and connect the dots, I think this time it could be for real for India's investment turn. Only time will tell you whether this is real. But at this point of time, if you look at what's happening on micro in terms of the Q4 investment numbers from GDP and what's the kind of commentary you're getting from the management on the ground, I think there are clear signs that capex is at last turning for the better. So going by all this, both from micro and micro commentaries, the capex at last could be, turning for India, and surprise could be in store for FY24 GDP numbers, because this investment turn, any turn in investments have got a huge multiplier effect for the economy. So one shouldn't underestimate that if the investment turns are going to be real, it could reflect on the final GDP numbers in a much bigger way. That's one of the reasons probably RBI as well as the government bodies, including the CEA, Chief Economic Advisor, both of these bodies are forecasting much healthier and higher growth for FY24 compared to the forecast from international bodies. So from all these, what is the final takeaway for investors? Yes, the macro could be turning and the micro commentary is great, and the investment turn could at last be happening in India, and the GDP numbers could be far better for FY24 if the capex cycle sustains. So, what is the key takeaway for investors? With markets trading near all-time highs, investment ideas are drying up. It's not easy to find new investment opportunities. So the space at which you can look at for building pipeline could be something closer to capital goods, infra, and proxy to investment outlays. So any proxy to a capex cycle turn or investment cycle turn could throw up good investment opportunities for identifying the next big win for investors. So with this, let me conclude this video post. Thanks for watching. Hope you found this very insightful, and look forward to the next one and see you in the next. Thanks a lot.
For more videos, subscribe to our YouTube channel for our regular updates and follow us on other social medias.